Thank you, Bill, and it's always good to be back with the OCP community, but I especially am excited to be here today in the European audience and stage because to talk about circular economy. You guys are unquestionably the leaders globally in terms of both cultural, social proclivity towards circular economy and circular economic models, but also from a regulatory perspective. So I just want to thank you all for continuing that. It's a great thing that we all can collaborate on. So our thesis is that to orchestrate a global circular IT hardware industry maximizes both the financial and the sustainability value of hardware assets in data centers and in technology industry at large. Now, we've talked, including on stage at the Global Summit in March, about the financial value of orchestrating a global data center industry circularly. And just to refresh some of that, from the financial perspective, we've modeled, working with many of our large hyperscale partners, which we'll come back to, that we think there's potentially as much as a $50 billion opportunity to recover value in creating secondary lifetimes for equipment, value that's currently slipping through the cracks in a more linear model where things are kind of decommissioned and disposed of or recycled. And on the flip side of that, creation of those secondary lifetimes also then has the potential to unlock and catalyze downstream markets who could be the beneficiaries of those secondary lifetimes on the order of $10 billion a year. So we think there's a huge financial opportunity here. Today I want to talk less about that and more about the potential impact that a circular IT hardware industry could have on sustainability and on decarbonization in particular. We're going to roll out some new modeling that we've worked on over the course of the past 6 to 12 months, which I think is fairly groundbreaking and comprehensive. And the goal of that and the goal of revealing it today is really to bring real data, real science, real math to bear to compel us all to continue the quest to move towards a more circular economic model in the sector. And we'll talk about the scale of why it's so important shortly. In the spirit of OCP, we want to do that open and together. So this is really to initiate and continue the conversation together. So just to set some context for everybody, Bill mentioned this briefly, a linear model is consumptive by nature, right? Most of the economic models around the world today in various industries, we take things from the earth, we turn them into goods, and then we use those goods, and then we dispose of those goods in some fashion. A circular model theoretically holds that instead of doing that very linear, consumptive kind of a process, we work towards systems that are more regenerative by design, where assets are sort of cascaded into secondary and tertiary lifetimes before they ultimately need to be disposed of. And the idea here is maximize the complete longevity of assets and keep them in their highest utility value for as long as possible. And the implication is that you can maximize both the financial opportunity of assets as well as the sustainability. In our context, what that means is we start with very large data center operators, hyperscale operators who for very good reason refresh equipment very quickly. And then historically, in a more linear model, what they've done is decommission those assets as a kind of last mile opportunity, and largely those things get harvested for components and funneled into the recycling streams. In a circular model, what you do instead is you think about multiple pathways for equipment. So you think about opportunities for internal reuse, you think about opportunities for taking those same rack scale systems and putting them into other data centers, and therefore minimizing the waste and the energy needed to transform them into something else. They can, of course, also be transformed into other higher order systems, and then ultimately also harvested for components and with the residual recycled. And the idea here is that orchestrating kind of the optimal mix there will enable us all to do better from both a financial and a sustainability perspective. So who's IT Renew? Very quickly, we're actually in the business of operationalizing circular data centers. We have a very large-scale global footprint for operations and logistics. We work with pretty much every one of the major hyperscale data center operators to decommission their assets. We do secure data sanitization as the start of that, and then we physically decommission those assets. And then we have hardware and software engineering organizations and manufacturing organizations, production organizations that turn those assets into these variety of products that feed these secondary markets. That's why we care about this. So now I want to step back a little bit and give some additional context. So this industry is poised and has already had, is poised to have tremendous positive influence on the most important challenges that we face, collectively. We're doing tremendously interesting things. But we're on also a bit of a dangerous trajectory, and we have sort of a dirty underside that we need to think more sophisticatedly about and more holistically about. And these are just a few stats, but the waste of this industry at the scale we operate is immense. So in 2016, the e-waste globally was 49 million tons. Just to give you a view of what that is the equivalent of 1 million 18-wheel trucks stacked back to back, lined up back to front, going all the way from New York to Bangkok and back. It's a tremendous amount of e-waste. It's growing, 10, 15, 20% a year at this rate. With that in mind, there are some people who are talking about the fact that we will actually run out of the elements needed for electronic components in the next 40 to 50 years, and that we better start looking to the deep seabed to start mining new things. Seems like the wrong approach to me. Seems like we ought to be thinking about it a little more critically from the beginning. On the carbon side, you just heard Misha talk a lot about AI. Super exciting stuff. I'm guessing that I'm underestimating, and that this MIT study is underestimating the fact that AI is expected to account for 10% of global electricity within the next 5 years. I suspect it's going to be more than that, right? So we're driving, a lot more because of the incredible power that we're building in our infrastructure. Collectively, the global community is theoretically striving for this 2-degree climate change global warming target, and doing a decent job in some ways. Unfortunately, the global technology industry is currently at about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and by some accounts on track to get to 8% by 2025. So we're sort of going the wrong direction, and that's why we're looking very hard at ways to drive the decarbonization story in ways that we haven't done historically. So I want to look at data center IT equipment specifically. This is Gartner data that came out in August. 65 million servers currently deployed in data centers that have an average of 50 racks or more, and an expectation of approximately 14 million to be sold into those environments over the course of the next 4 years. So the math is theoretically simple. You should end up with an installed base of servers of about 121 million. But it isn't actually quite that simple, because the installed base projected at the end of 2023 is actually 75 million, which means that there's close to 50 million servers which are going to be EOL'd between now and the end of 2023. Again, immense amount of waste that's coming out of our industry. So we're doing some things really, really well, especially in the OCP community, making great progress. Everybody's working hard on PUE. We're working hard on cooling. We're working hard on utilization, power scaling, obviously continued gains in performance per watt. And there's great examples of continued push here, right? The Boden Data Center in Sweden is doing amazing work to try to continue to push these boundaries and do advanced R&D, and the OCP community is part of that. Renewables is a very, very big, important one, and everybody's doing it. Google just announced this week that they're doing another 10 renewables projects, $3 billion of investment in Europe specifically. And you can see just a smattering of headlines here. This is across from mid-sized data centers and colo facilities and the very large hyperscalers. Everybody's focused on this. It is super, super critical, and we should keep doing that. I'm going to assume that we succeed in that. So the question then is, everything we just talked about is really related to the operational phase of equipment, the energy consumed in running IT equipment and running data centers. That's called use phase or operational phase energy, or scope 1 emissions. When we think about that dangerous trajectory we're on, then I think it's imperative to say, but wait a minute, where else should we be looking for the next big knobs to turn? If we assume that we're doing well on the operational side, let's make sure we're looking at the whole picture. And if you look at sort of everything that happens before equipment gets to the door of a data center, so everything involved from mining to manufacturing of equipment, that's I've called the pre-use phase here. And then at the end of a lifetime in a data center, of course, things get recycled and go through an end of life or a post-use phase. Collectively, those two bookends are called Scope 3 emissions or embodied energy, and that's what we're focused on today, because if we could move to a circular model, enable secondary lifetimes, then we could avoid some of that new manufacturing, right? So a little more granularly about the process, and this becomes sort of the system boundaries of the model that we're going to talk about. What happens is, in our world, we take a bunch of raw materials, we use a bunch of energy, and then we literally mine materials out of the earth, we process those in some form, then we shift to manufacturing, we create components, boards, chips, DIMMs, et cetera, drives, power supplies. We move them somewhere else, we assemble them into servers and racks, and then we transport them to this little sliver here, which is the use phase, where they're run in a data center. And then at the end of that, first useful life, they're typically transported again into some recycling, sorting, shredding, smelting process. So what we've done in the model is kind of started with this component manufacturing bit in the middle and said, what is the mass balance of every single one of those components? How much gold is in there? How many capacitors are in there? What's the technology that was used to produce them? How much cobalt is in there? Blah, blah, blah. And then we work back and we say, we've analyzed exactly what it took to get those materials out of the earth, to manufacture them, to assemble them into servers and racks, how much electricity was consumed to run them, and then how much energy is used to disassemble them and get them into the end-of-life process at the end. And of course, I should say it more specifically, what we're looking at here is this output side of this equation, right? So as we do this whole process, it has a cost, and that cost comes in the form of emissions and waste. And we're going to focus specifically in this modeling exercise on the carbon side of things. So we've focused on compute equipment only, because this is a very challenging, hairy problem thing to wrestle with. So we've tried to keep it very specific so that we can get very accurate and precise data. We've assumed OCP-style racks, bare bones x86 servers. In this specific case, we're using an EU data center based in Sweden. Components are manufactured in China, and rack and server assembly happens in Eastern Europe. Now, we didn't do this alone. We've looked at 50 or 60, I think, all of the industry and academic papers out there that contribute various parts of the data and analysis. We've conducted interviews with experts across the entire life cycle that I just described. We've engaged, I think, probably the best consulting firm in the world on this that is part of the Gabi technology platform that does life cycle analysis to help validate and contribute some of this. And of course, we have our own data because remember, we decommission equipment globally for all of the major hyperscale data centers. And lastly, just to point out, this is a version 1.0 model. We feel very strongly that it is directionally robust. It's a start. It's meant to drive future collaboration and conversation with all of you. So it turns out it really, really matters. So if you look at just a 3-year lifetime for equipment, the pre-use phase is 3/4 of the puzzle. So this is really, really encouraging from a circular economic approach, because that says if we can avoid some of that new manufacturing, then we might see some really meaningful gains. So we move then to, okay, if embodied energy really matters, then let's quantify a little mini system that's circular that lets us compare the base case, traditional model, non-circular, with the circular model. And we do that over a series of life cycles such that we can model kind of upstream hyperscaler typical behavior, run something for 3 years, decommission it, run something for 3 years, decommission it, and combine that with the more typical smaller scale data center operator life cycles, which is more likely to be run for a full lifetime, maybe as much as 9 years. And we do it over a series of those cycles so that we can we can model the full kind of transition of Moore's law and compute efficiency, so you can adequately adjust and model the different power consumption of older equipment and so forth. So in this case, what you see here is sort of my base case scenario. The big orange block is the 76% embodied energy. The yellow block is operational energy. Not surprising, as we just saw those numbers. When you move to a circular model, you can see that there's pretty significant impacts, and this is the avoidance of new manufacturing. So embodied energy decreases by 52%. Operational, of course, increases slightly. We're running more equipment for slightly longer, right? But the net effect of that is that as a system, we can deliver 24% net CO2 equivalent savings. And just to put that in perspective, that same 24% is equal to almost 70% of the base case operational energy. So we can try to get 74% more PUE, which we should try to do as well, but this is, in other words, a very, very good, powerful place for us to look from a sustainability perspective. So then there's an obvious question. Well, if this is the right thing to do for sustainability, is it gonna cost me more to do it? And the answer is no. TCO is also better, coincidentally also 24%. If you make a series of assumptions about Moore's law projection, this is annualized performance per watt to 13% over the course of the next 10 years on kind of a declining rate. Think about how depreciation is handled over 3, 6, 9-year chunks. Assume costs for power and utilization rates and so forth. The system TCO also comes down about 24%. And that, importantly, is shared between the upstream, primary lifetime users, hyperscalers, and the downstream secondary or smaller scale data center operators. You guys run data centers. The next question is, well, but can I really run it that long? And the answer is yes. Not only are the technology treadmills designed to run that long, but from a purely economic life perspective, and making the same assumptions and more about initial CapEx and overhead of facilities and so forth, the economic life says that this thing can run for more than 9 years, valuably. Next question you might have is, but we're just talking about IT equipment, so maybe I'm gonna need more data centers if I run this older stuff for longer. And the answer to that is also no. So make the same assumptions about Moore's law, start with a data center of 150,000 square feet in this case, make some reasonable assumptions about kind of compute and storage growth requirements, look over a 10-year time horizon. In the base case here, I've started with a data center that's 40% full, and you can see that in no case do I get over 70, 74% of kind of filled capacity on a square footage basis. Of course, people start more full. If you start at 60% full, you definitely are gonna need a new data center. But you're gonna need it in either case, whether you use full new equipment or whether you introduce half recertified equipment for the workloads that make sense. Same thing, if you double Moore's law, you don't need a new data center. And really one of the important points here is, from a growth perspective, it's really about whether your business growth is outpacing compute efficiency growth or not. If you increase the growth rate, then yes, of course you're gonna need a new data center, but the point here is that recertified equipment doesn't materially change that. You need it 1 year earlier. So still sounding pretty positive. If we look at the potential for us to have impact at scale outside of the mini system, go back to my 46 million servers that are gonna be EOL'd over the course of the next 4 years. Let's assume that 15 million of those are ODM servers. What if we could make those circular? Well, that would be 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent savings that we could get, which happens to be 7.8 million round-trip flights from San Francisco to Amsterdam, or the equivalent of every one of the 800 people in this event going back and forth 27 times a day or 9,750 times over the course of the next year. It's really impactful, right? But let's think bigger. What if we could move over time towards operationalizing the entire IT hardware industry and make all of the end-of-life servers circular? That's 31 million tons of CO2e. That's the equivalent of almost 7 million annual cars annual emissions, right? Or all of the cars in Amsterdam coming off the road for 17 years. Again, very, very significant impact. From an e-waste perspective, almost 1 million tons of waste. So we talked about trucks before. That was 1 million trucks from New York to Bangkok and back. In our case, not so big. It's about 500 trucks, but they could go all the way from here in Amsterdam to Brussels and back and a little bit more. So it feels like a really great statement we could go make collectively at the EC to continue this quest. So this might seem daunting, right? How are we gonna do it? What does it look like in action? The good news is it's happening today. Right? We're in this business and we're doing that in collaboration with a lot of partners, both upstream and downstream. What it takes is a lot more than open. Open is essential. The Open Compute Project in platform is essential. A lot of open source software is essential. But it takes product and design and engineering resources across both hardware and open source software to enable the transition of products from first lifetimes into second lifetimes. It takes a global operations and logistics footprint, and it takes market making and kind of diversity of downstream channel development at very large scale. Ultimately, that's a set of services and products that become the connective tissue of this whole thing. But it also requires more than just products and services, right? This shift is a global transformation of an industry, and it requires all of us to adopt a new mindset and kind of a shared ethos and work together on it. Now, I'm super excited to say that this is really truly happening today, and you can come see it in the IT Renew booth in the exhibit hall in the form of a product solution suite called Sesame. So Sesame is truly the first of its kind, recertified, open hardware, compute, and storage systems. It comes in both rack scale form factors that are optimized for a variety of common cloud service provider and enterprise workloads. Think Kubernetes, think AI, think converged, all of those kinds of things that you are accustomed to wanting to do. Performance optimized for a variety of workloads. Warranted. There's absolutely no compromise here to quality. These things come with standard 3- and 6-year warranties. Importantly, we also recognize that it has been hard heretofore with the open compute community for the non-hyperscalers to get access to and to really be effective with open hardware. So one of the things that we've done in addition to kind of bringing forth integrated solutions and warranties and support and so forth is that we have new form factors that enable developers to get started very quickly. We have new form factors that enable edge distributed environments instead of just centralized cloud kind of rack scale environments. And this is really uniquely enabled by our upstream relationships with the hyperscale community, right? We have availability of supply at a scale that lets the downstream markets begin to depend on this as everything as good, no compromise as new equipment, but with massively disruptive TCO opportunity. So remember, this is recertified circular equipment, not only best from a sustainability perspective, but we're able to bring it to market in a way that is very disruptive and transformational from a TCO perspective. So I hope everybody comes to check that out. Just to summarize here in closing, it is truly both our opportunity and our imperative, right? I alluded to the financial opportunity. What this means is that constituents across the ecosystem that we're in are motivated. So there's a $50 billion potential value recovery opportunity for our upstream hyperscale partners. That's motivation to help invest in enabling secondary lifetimes for equipment. There is a potentially $10 billion a year market downstream that is currently blocked by a combination of both budgets, resources, skills, access. That's motivation for people to want to be recipients of very disruptive economic hardware equipment that comes with no compromise to quality and performance. Today, we talked about both the TCO savings at the system level. There's even more TCO savings for the downstream customers when you think about actually not just the benefit of avoiding new manufacturing, but then you also say, now I get to take this circular equipment and compare TCO against buying new proprietary equipment. That's a much even more significant TCO opportunity. And the CO2e savings is, as we talked about, very, very significant and compelling and important as we as an industry try to harness all that positive potential without also trashing the planet. Last point I want to make here is, we haven't talked about this, but the UN has a sustainable development goal of getting to universal access by 2030 and forecasts that there is currently a $100 billion gap in IT infrastructure funding to get there. So if half the people in the world are still not online, and we could bring circular equipment, second life equipment, to enable some of the pursuits to get those people online at very much lower cost and disruptive economics, and we could free up some of that budget runway, I think that would be a win for us all collectively as a community. So I hope to work with all of you guys. I hope to come see the products. I'm happy to talk to you about the data in detail, and I hope this is the beginning of a great conversation and collaboration going forward. So thank you very much.
Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. Come on, step back up. Step back up. Man, what an opportunity. What a responsibility that we have.
We do.
I know, it's overwhelming. So my mind is going crazy. What can we do? What if you could ask us one thing to do that's going to help enable that secondary user or really that, third generation user, what can we do as a community?
You know, I think the best thing is to continue to collaborate from design of systems through decommissioning and recommissioning of systems on the technology side. Like that's what this community brings. And in order to ensure, time to market and quality and supportability and serviceability and access, usefulness, we need to continue to do things that enable that in the hardware and in the software. So for example, the open source firmware efforts on Linux boot and OpenBMC and so forth are super, super critical to all of this and to us as a company, but to us as an ecosystem beginning to change the way this model, the whole industry performs.
I like that answer. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your research and look forward to
Thanks, Bill.
more of this. So thank you, Ollie Fenn.